here you need to know something about constraints. So SQL constraints are used to specify rules for the data in a table, right? So if there is any violation between the constraint and the data action, the action is aborted by the constraint, right? So let us check out the constraints that are used while creating a table, right? So in SQL, while you are creating a table, we can enforce the following constraints. So not null constraint, unique constraint, primary key is a constraint. So what do you mean by not null constraint? So it indicates that a particular column name cannot store null values, right? So once you give a particular attribute as not null, it means that the particular column cannot store null values. It has to be filled by the end user while inserting records in the table. And unique constraint, it ensures that each row, each record in a table must have a unique value, right? So unique means it should be unique. The particular attribute should be unique. That particular attribute value should be unique in a table. And not null constraint means a particular column or an attribute cannot have null values. And the primary key constraint is a combination of not null constraint and unique constraint, right? So whenever you say something as a primary key, right? So for example, your roll number is a primary key, and whenever I store a student information in a relation, roll number, since roll number is a primary key, it means that it should have not null constraint, right? One should enter a valid roll number. It should not hold null values in a table, and similarly it should be unique, right? So primary key, it is used to uniquely identify a particular record in a table, and primary key should satisfy the not null constraint as well as unique constraint, right? Then we have this foreign key constraint. So it ensures referential integrity and constraints in a data or in a table, right? So it ensures the referential integrity of the data in one table to match the values in another table, right? So whenever you are going to refer the primary key of one table in another table, we call it as foreign key. So you need to match the values of one table in another table by using this foreign key constraint, right? So you can also have this check constraint, right? So you can check constraint ensures that the value in a column meets a specific condition, right? So for example, bank, they may have some check constraint. They ensures that the balance value is going to be always greater than 1,000 rupees for savings account, right? So you can enforce some constraint. And default keyword specifies a default value when specified none for this column, right? So when the user has not given any value for an attribute, the default constraint can be applied to get some default values for a particular attribute, right? So the syntax of a create table command can be right, it can be refined by adding the constraint syntax. So create table, table name, again you have column name one, data type with size of the particular attribute or column name, and you can have constraint name, right? You can have different constraints for different attributes, right? So in the first class I taught you about integrity constraints, right? So integrity constraints means I can have different constraints for different set of attributes in a table, right? So for example, let us look into this table, create table persons, right? So person ID is going to be, it is a integer data type and it is not null, right? And the last statement I have defined person ID as unique also, right? I'm going to enforce unique constraint also. So basically it's going to be a primary key. So since it has both since we are going to enforce not null constraint as well as unique constraint for person ID, then we consider person ID as a primary key, and not last name is going to be varchar data type, not null, and so on, right? So it's possible to enforce this type of constraints in the case of DBMS easily, whereas it is very difficult to enforce the constraints in the case of file processing system. So in file processing system, you may have one or two constraints, but when the number of constraints becomes very large, right? So here, for example, we have constraints for person ID, we have constraints for last name and so on, right? So we can add some more constraints also, right? Some more constraints for another table orders. So create table orders, right? So you perform some transaction, you order something, order ID is going to be not null, order number int not null, the person ID is going to be int. So in orders table, order ID is going to be the primary key, and the person ID is going to be the primary key of persons table, right? So foreign key person ID references persons person ID, right? So here person ID is going to be a foreign key that references persons person ID, right? So you can here they have enforced the primary key constraint, they have enforced the foreign key constraint, they have in a relational data model we have enforced not null constraint and so on. So it's possible to enforce multiple constraints in a relational data model, right? So this is how you create a table with both primary key constraint as well as foreign key constraint, right? So we generally use foreign key to connect multiple tables, right? So I have student table, then I have department table, right? So student table may have the foreign key constraint department ID, so that by which I can connect or join student table with department table and get more information about student details, right? So this is about working with foreign key constraint. So a foreign key constraint, a foreign key in one table points to a primary key in another table, right? So the following SQL creates a foreign key on a person ID column when the orders table is created, right? So initially we were working with the persons table, which had a person ID as a primary key, last name, first name, address, city, and so on. So you all know that a primary key is used to uniquely identify each and every record in a database. So primary key means it must have not null values and it should be unique. So we have created a table with primary key constraint, right? So primary key of person ID. And you also know how to create or you need to know how to enforce foreign key constraint on a table, right? So we have the next table orders. So order ID is going to be primary key order ID, and foreign key is going to be person ID. So foreign key person ID references persons person ID, right? So this is how you refer the foreign key of foreign key, or you refer the primary key of one relation in another relation, right? So the next command is going to be alter table. So alter table command is used to add a new attribute in a relation in the schema definition, or alter table command can also be used to drop some attributes in a relation, right? So here we are using alter table command to add foreign key over a period of time, right? So initially I have created only orders table with order ID, order number, and so on. So if I want to add a foreign key constraint in a relation over a period of time, I can use alter table orders, add foreign key person ID references persons person ID, right? So alter table is used to change the schema definition structure of the database. It can be used to add an attribute or drop an attribute, or it can be used to add primary key constraint or foreign key constraints after a particular table is created, right? Right. So we also have this check constraint. As I said that check constraint, it is used to limit the value range that can be placed in the column, right? So for example, we need to ensure that the person ID is always greater than 0, right? So person ID, integer data type, not null, last name, varchar data type, and so on. So check person ID is going to be greater than 0, right? So we use it in some other applications. Check balance is going to be, you have a create table account number, name of the customer, balance, and so on. Check balance is going to be greater than 0, or check balance is going to be greater than 1000. So if the user tries to withdraw below rupees 1000, it raises an exception, and right, so the end user cannot withdraw if the check constraint is violated.